Hello, and welcome to another episode of Northstar Talks Politics. For those looking at the screen and reading this already, you can probably guess this is going to be a bit of an edgier video, which, as the title probably will indicate, something along the lines of no, UBI isn't stupid really, or universal basic income really isn't a bad idea. Now, I'm going to take this though from a different angle, and there's a lot of bad faith discussion about this and a lot of narrow-minded discussion. So this is more of a I like to think of it as a big picture, not a big picture analysis, but a more inclusive analysis that doesn't get trapped in certain ways of thinking based on dogmatism. One of the problems with this discussion is some of the main groups that argue universal basic income are conservatives, traditional neoliberals, in maybe that would be considered centrists in common parlance. Third way neoliberals, that's like Bill Clinton's, what the U.S. Democratic Party. They're slightly more left wing than the centrists. Progressives or social democrats, those are really the same thing. Democratic socialists, very small group, but this is more closer to my take on this, and Marxist-Leninists. These are the groups that all will debate universal basic income, and they all get set in and libertarian capitalists, i.e., they've stolen the term libertarian from anarchists, who are not as significant a voice to even discuss their views. They're even smaller grouped in democratic socialists, but they have been very influential in this discussion. So these are like the ultra free market types who are actually usually in favor of UBI, but not for the right reasons. And the important thing about it is, how is it funded? But first of all, this pamphlet, you might call it, it's only 14 pages. Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen R. Jodzi. And I mean, 3 pages, 4 or 5. It's actually only like 9 pages of content, and there's a picture. Elena Lagudinova, the youngest female partisan fighting against Bulgaria's Nazi-allied monarchy during World War II. Yes, because Bulgaria's government allied with the Nazis under their monarchy, and then later the actual fascists took over from the monarch. And then later more pro-Western democracy elements took over briefly from them, and then the communists took over. So there were like 4 governments in Bulgaria during the World War II years. Anyways, she earned her PhD in agrobiology and worked as a research scientist before she became president of the committee of the Bulgarian Women's Movement. So she was one of the communists. A lot of the partisans were. Lagudinova led the Bulgarian delegation to the 1975 United Nations First World Conference on Women. Because, yeah, the communists actually took a leading role in early International Women's Day, a lot of women's rights. In case, for those who don't know their history or have been propagandized on it, the U.S. actually lagged behind in women's rights versus the socialist world in the 60s, 70s. It wasn't till the sexual revolution hit the United States and real equality started to blossom that the U.S. really started to become a world leader in women's rights. There was kind of an inflection point. This came after civil rights, and that's not a coincidence, because undoing the oppression of racial minorities in the U.S. to some small degree opened the way for focusing on women's rights. And in fact, those went hand in hand to some degree. They were occurring at the same time. Anyway, Lagudinova led the Bulgarian delegation. Bulgaria was in the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, to the 1975 United Nations First World Conference Women. Because free markets discriminate against those who bear children, Lagudinova believed that only state intervention could support women in their dual roles as workers and mothers. So that was her take on it, is that free markets discriminate against women, which is true in a way if having kids is not monetized in any way, which is usually not under capitalism. It's something that's sidetracking one's career and interferes with earning potential. And it gets in the way of both roles, actually. For instance, my mother stopped her career to have kids. She never got back into it. She kind of always resented having kids, resented me in some way, even though it was not obviously my fault that I was born. She had kids also to make my dad, who was abusive, happier, which that's always a terrible reason to have kids. Um, didn't stop the abuse, just brought someone else into it. And because of discrimination against women stopping to have kids, it ruined her career. Author's note: for the last 20 years, I've studied the social impacts of the political and economic transition from state socialism, that is, century planned socialist economies like in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, to capitalism in Eastern Europe. Because after the end of the Cold War, Eastern Europe went capitalist. There were horrendous disruptions of people's lives, with a lot of people dying during this transitional period. It was horrible poverty. Much worse. No matter what you think of the Iron Curtain, the Warsaw Pact, or the Soviet Union, things were much worse for people during that transitional phase of about 20 years. And arguably, things are worse than they would have been given the rate things were getting better in the Soviet Union. Things are still not caught up to where they would have been, although in some countries, particularly Poland, and now, it's ironically, the Ukraine war, Russia, are starting to catch up where they would have been if the Soviet Union had not fallen. But most, in the Baltic countries, they've actually exceeded where they would have been. So there are a few countries that are doing better, but the general trend, especially in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Belarus, Hungary, Slovakia, so that's the eastern part of what was Czechoslovakia, they're all doing much worse than they would have if the Soviet Union was still around. They lost all this time in development, and even if they're developing at a faster pace now, in some cases, they have not made up the lost time. And that's only comparing to how they were developing in the end of the Soviet Union, when it was weakening and headed towards collapse. At the best growth years, the Soviet Union was growing much, and its Warsaw Pact allies were growing much faster than these countries are growing now. For the last 20 years, I've studied the social impacts of the political and economic transition. Although I first traveled through the region just months after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, my professional interest began in 1997 when I started conducting research on the impacts of the collapse of communist ideology on ordinary people. First as a PhD student, and later as a university professor. I lived for more than 3 years in Bulgaria and 19 months in both Eastern and Western Germany. In the summer of 1990, I also spent 2 months traveling through Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the soon-to-disappear German Democratic Republic, that is, East Germany. In the intervening years, I've been a frequent visitor to Eastern Europe, delivering invited lectures in cities such as Belgrade, Bucharest, Budapest, and Warsaw. So, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland. Because I often travel by car, bus, and train, I've seen firsthand the ravages of neoliberal capitalism. That's the variant of capitalism that took over Eastern Europe and has eaten much of the world. There's even articles, Neoliberals and the Ideology of the World. And I've even talked about these articles and read parts of them on some of my previous videos in my politics playlist. So do check those out, viewers. So it's not social democracy capitalism. It's not the Scandinavian model that overtook Eastern Europe. It's more of the U.S. weak labor unions, weak labor rights, low wages, low taxation form of capitalism that took over Eastern Europe, which is obviously the worst version for human welfare when you look at the statistics. Because I often travel by car, bus, and train, I've seen firsthand the ravages across the region. Because, bleak landscapes, pockmarked by the decrepit remains of once thriving factories, giving way to new suburbs with Walmart-style megastores selling 42 different types of shampoo. I've also studied how the institution of unregulated free markets in Eastern Europe returned many women to a subordinate status economically dependent on men. Since 2004, this is not me saying this is the author. Since 2004, I've published 6 scholarly books and over 3 dozen articles and essays using empirical evidence gathered from archives, interviews, and extended ethnographic fieldwork. So ethnographic fieldwork is where you go into community and usually live among them for an extended period of time to get a really in-depth view of how things are going. You do interviews, you follow people in their daily lives. It's not just like you just go in, you're there for a day, and you leave. It's much more careful, extensive field work, and it produces much more valid results. Although the main risk is that you become to be biased in favor of the people that you're following. In this book, I draw on over 20 years of research and teaching to write an introductory primer for a general audience interested in European socialist feminist theories, the experience of 20th century state socialism, and their lessons for the present day. So, feminism, socialism, the collapse of communism. After the unexpected success of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primaries, socialist ideas are circulating more broadly among the American public. It is essential, Bernie Sanders is a social democrat, not a socialist, but because he called himself a socialist, it did open the doors to people talking about actual socialist ideas, even though that's not what he is proposing. It is essential that we pause and learn from the experiences of the past, examining both good and bad, because I believe in the pursuit of historical nuance, as do I. It's very important, and nuance is often ignored in these discussions, which is a problem. And that there were some redeeming qualities of state socialism. I will inevitably be accused of being an apologist for Stalinism. Yeah, as would I. But there were some redeeming qualities. This is correct. Vitriolic and hominin attacks are the reality of our hyperpolarized political climate. Bingo. And I find it quite ironic that those who claim to abhor totalitarianism have no trouble silencing speech or unleashing hysterical Twitter mobs. Mm-hmm. The German political theorist Rosa Luxemburg once said, "Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently." Yeah, it's not real freedom if you're not allowed to think differently. There are problems with the lack of freedom in that sense under communism as well. But we have not achieved the great blossoming of freedom that people claimed would happen. If anything, things have become less free since then, the Cold War. This book is about learning to think differently with regard to the state socialist past, our neoliberal capitalist present, and the path to our collective future. Throughout this book, I use the term state socialism or state socialist to refer to the states of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, dominated by ruling communist parties where political freedoms were curtailed. Correct. In favor of economic freedoms, political freedoms were entailed. I use the term democratic socialism or democratic socialist to refer to countries where socialist principles are championed by parties that compete in free and fair elections and where political rights are maintained. That could be socialist if the parties are actually championing socialist principles. People misidentify parties as doing so that aren't. For instance, Scandinavian social democrat parties are not socialist. Salvador Allende's Chile was socialist. They were elected in a free and fair election and couped by the fascist Pinochet, supported by the CIA, even if the CIA didn't organize the coup they wanted to happen, and they put propaganda to encourage it to happen and assassinate people who stood against it, so they basically caused it. Although many parties referred to themselves as communists, that term denotes the ideal of a society where all economic assets are collectively owned. Yep, this person is correctly going into what the term actually means, how it refers to late stage socialism or the utopia at the end of the tunnel, of the end of the path, whatever, for Marxists, and the state and a lot have withered away. In no case has real communism been achieved. Yep. And therefore I try to avoid this term when referring to actually existing states, what the author will call state socialism here. On the topic of semantics, that is the terms for things, I've also endeavored to be sensitive to contemporary intersectional vocabularies. For example, when I talk about women in this book, I'm primarily referring to cisgender women as opposed to transgenders. Persons being clear. The 19th and 20th century socialist women question did not consider unique needs of trans women, but I have no desire to exclude or alienate trans women from the current discussion. Similarly, in my discussion on maternity, I do recognize that I'm discussing those who are female assigned at birth. But for the sake of simplicity, I use the term woman, even though this category includes some who identify as men or other genders. Because this is an introductory book, there will be places in the text where I do not go into full detail about the debates surrounding topics such as universal basic income, surplus value extraction, or gender-based quotas. Is this a book, or is this just a sample at the beginning of it? In particular, although I believe they are absolutely essential, I don't spend a lot of time discussing universal single-payer healthcare or free public post-secondary education, as free college, because I believe these policies have been discussed at length elsewhere. I hope readers are inspired to explore more about the issues related in these pages. Taking this book is that's enough of the foreword. This is picture of the first woman in space. The Soviets put the first woman in space way before the United States, by the way. And it wasn't just some posturing thing. The Soviet uh, military had a long tradition of women serving in uniform, for instance. So whether, regardless of what you think of their motives, the Soviets would put men and women both in danger. And so the female astronaut was not just a publicity stunt. The U.S. almost did women in space as a publicity stunt, but then it got crushed by, well, politics, because it was always just a publicity stunt. And it was a long time till first female astronaut from the West, as opposed to socialist countries. Introduction might be suffering from capitalism. The argument of this book can be summed up succinctly. Unregulated capitalism is bad for women. If we adopt some ideas from socialism, women will have better lives. If done properly, socialism leads to economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. Finding a way into a better future requires learning from the mistakes of the past, including a thoughtful assessment of the history of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe. That's it. If you like the idea of such outcomes, then come along for an exploration of how it might change things. If you're dubious because you don't understand why capitalism as an economic system is uniquely bad for women, and if you doubt that there could be anything good about socialism, this short treatise will provide some illumination. If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a xenophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and get back to your parents' basement right now. This is in the book. So this is kind of a bit of nastiness there, but not that some of these people don't deserve it, but it paints with too broad of a brush why people it ignores, for instance, the religious conservatives who might be opposed for reasons that aren't just because they're trolls. Anyways, of course, some might argue that unregulated capitalism sucks for almost everyone. But I want to focus on how capitalism disproportionately harms women. Competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. This means humans who get pink hats in the hospital and the letter F next to the name on their birth certificate, as if we've already failed by not coming into the world as a boy. Competitive labor markets also, referring to how F refers to failing grade, competitive labor markets also devalue those expected to be the primary caregivers of children. Although societal attitudes have evolved in this regard, our idealization of motherhood means that most of us still believe that baby needs mama a whole lot more than papa, at least until the child is old enough to play sports. Others will argue that unregulated capitalism is not bad for all women. But yes, for those women lucky enough to sit at the top of the income distribution, the system works pretty well. Hey, so-called girl bosses. Although women at the executive level still face gender pay gaps or remain underrepresented leadership positions, on the whole, things aren't too shabby for the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. Of course, sexual harassment still hinders progress even for those at the top, and too many women believe that if you want to run with the big dogs, you may have to suck it up and ignore the gossiping and unwanted advances. Ignore the groping and unwanted advances. And race, that's even worse than gossiping. And race plays an important role as well. White women do a lot better in aggregate than do women of color. But when we look at society as a whole, on average, women are comparatively worse off in countries where markets are less encumbered by regulation, taxation, and public enterprises than they are in nations where state revenues support greater levels of redistribution and larger social safety nets. Yeah, so this is actually a book. This is just the beginning of it, but I do recommend reading this book. It's entitled Why Women Better Sex Under Socialism. It's edgy enough that I thought I would start this, and you can see some of the chapters here. Women like men, but cheaper on work, refers to how capitalists, that is, factory owners and such, exploit women, pay them lower wages. What to expect when you're expecting exploitation of motherhood, exploitation of pregnant women in particular. Pantsuits are not enough on leadership. Girl bosses. Capitalism between the sheets on sex, part 1, to each according to her needs, and sex, part 2, from barricades to ballot boxes on citizenship. It's quite a book that's received quite a lot of attention. And it's relevant to discussion, because one of the arguments for universal basic income is mental health. Indeed, the mental health effects of a universal basic income, a synthesis of the evidence from previous pilots. There have been pilot studies in universal basic income. It has been done on small scales. It's usually showed large increases in mental health. Our review has produced, this is a review of the various studies, our review has produced evidence suggests that prophecies surrounding the mental health benefits of UBI are at least partially justified. However, future studies should aim to be conducted at an area level. This is typical academics. We must always study it more, but that's true. There's always more to learn. With an adequately powered sample size, that is, do it with more people and investigate the interventions of a considerable duration using longitudinal design. Do do it for longer, do it with more people, basically. But there's considerable evidence. UBI leads to better mental health from the studies that have been done. Of course, these studies, and then this talks about how it doesn't lead to different, relatively greater improvements. It doesn't lead to greater improvements for women than men in a country where there's already small gender gaps like Finland. Of course, the United States has much greater gender gaps, and this is something to note. One of the arguments, this is somewhat a counter to this. UBI can be considered a socialistic policy, although again, libertarian capitalists favor it because they're all free market and reducing the size of the welfare state. And this is more about the mental health impacts. So, enough to give a little context and a little some more authoritative, supposedly authoritative stuff to think about. But a little more free-form discussion here. There are a few things. First of all, you get stubborn people like Hakeem, a Marxist-Leninist who's popular on YouTube, who will go and say UBI is a terrible thing, really, or stupid idea, really. And what does he say? He basically, his argument boils down to the idea that we don't know what's going to be paid for, because he is correct that a critical component of arguing for something like UBI is how is it going to be paid for? Is it going to be paid for by raising taxes on the rich, or is it going to be paid for by cutting welfare programs that primarily go to the poor? Is going to be paid for by both, because he always ignores the potential of compromise when he's talking about these things. I mean, he obviously wants a state socialist system and to move beyond capitalism, so he maybe is a little less focused on what can be done immediately. Since you could tax the rich more and cut welfare systems and make the UBI so large that even the worst off are better off than they were before, and yet the rich are getting taxed more. One thing that's always missing from discussions of UBI is how it's going to be paid for. And specifically, people will talk about the effects of it. They'll argue things like rents will just go up because of inflation, but they ignore that you have to pay for something like this. And if you pay for it, there's only two ways to do it: deficit spending or taxation. If you pay for it with taxation, you're not going to see things like rents go up as much as UBI, because taxation is going to reduce the amount of money that's out there chasing new property. So let's say you tax the rich, but not just the super rich. People who are wealthy enough to own multiple properties are paying somewhat higher taxes, and the billionaires are paying much higher taxes. So millionaires are paying a little bit higher. The U.S. property values are so high. If you own like 3 properties, you're a millionaire. So millionaires are paying 5% higher taxes. Billionaires are paying 20% higher, kind of thing. People argue, well, the landlords will just raise rents. Well, here's the thing: people have more money to pay for rent, yes, but ultimately one of the factors that determines things like rents is how much money is chasing the properties in terms of the property market, because rents exist in competition with the private housing market in terms of people buying their own homes. If the price to buy your own home goes up, rents go up. If the price to buy your home goes down, rents go down. So if you tax the wealthier people, they're going to have less money to buy properties, either for renting them out or for their own personal use. Some people want 3-4 homes they're not even renting, they're just living in. And that's going to have an effect that's going to lead to less of an increase in rents because the money's being removed. And where's that money being removed to? It's being taken up in taxes and given out in UBI. So yes, there will likely be some increase in rents, but not by as much. You might see $1,000 a month UBI, and the cost of living might go up $700. People are still $300 better off. This is why numbers are so important. You can't just make these absolute statements like, well, there's this feedback mechanism. Yes, I'm a research biologist by training. I've studied feedback mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms exist all the time in the human body, but very often feedback mechanisms don't mean that this thing that's driving a given process won't have any effect at all. It just means it'll have less of an effect than you would think, because the feedback mechanism will dampen that effect. Economies work often the same way. You will see, people won't be $1,000 better off, but they'll be $300 or $400 or $500 better off, because there'll be some increase in rents and food prices and such, but it won't be as much. And the thing that determines partly the balance between those is how the program is funded in the first place. Um, Actually, if you do a lot of deficit spending, most of the UBI will be eaten up by just higher prices because deficit spending is inherently inflationary. But if you tax the rich to pay for the UBI, so you do it in a quote budget neutral way by taxing the rich, uh, then so you tax them as much as you give on UBI, then you will not see all that money eaten up. Because the important thing is that is the removal of money from the economy with the taxation. That's the critical element that's in some ways almost more important because even if you just tax the rich and didn't do UBI, it would actually decrease prices for things like rent a little bit because there'd be less money chasing, so even just reducing the budget deficit and taxing the rich more would already lead to lower rents. And then you throw UBI in and that will give people money and you can maintain a higher level of taxation if you have the UBI because there's more money circulating in the economy and you don't risk causing deflation. If you tax a whole bunch and don't spend the money and just put it in government coffers, that will eventually lead to deflation. Which means even if rents don't go up in dollar values, they've effectively gone up because each dollar is worth more than it used to be. With deflation, it's the opposite inflation where each dollar is worth less. So, how you pay for something matters. Then there's the mental health impact. Of course, these mental health impact arguments always come from looking at small pilot studies of UBI where it doesn't substantially affect the overall amount of welfare programs that exist in society because it's only being trialed with a small number of people. The UBI doesn't affect the taxation rates, which is why people, argued correctly that you need something that's on a broader scale. You need a whole society to do UBI to really know what's going to happen. But I can say, as someone who's disabled with long COVID, dealing with the bureaucratic state, trying to get welfare assistance when I'm disabled and too sick to work most jobs and struggle even to sit down and do a few YouTube videos. I mean, I'm less than 30 minutes in this video. I'm getting really tired. I would struggle to work more than 3-hour shifts with most jobs without taking a long break lying down. I really have very limited energy with my long COVID. Struggling with the bureaucratic state, it's paperwork, it's bullshit rules, it's complexity, it's bureaucrats who can sometimes be hostile or rude. These things are traumatizing and difficult for people, and they waste labor. The bureaucratic labor is not used productively. If you do the UBI, and this is something even the libertarian capitalists agree on, you eliminate a lot of these bureaucrats. Now, some Marxists will say, oh, that's bad, eliminating bureaucrats. These are jobs. Yes, they're jobs that contribute no real value to society. And the money that's used to pay bureaucrat salaries could be used to have an even larger UBI. It could be used to tax the rich more. It could be used to just cut taxes on the poor without increasing the UBI. And ordinary people might be able to put the money into, or even, lower middle class taxes. Of course, a lot of people aren't paying taxes anyways because taxes are so low often in the working class. So that has already reached its limit. But in places where it hasn't, that could help. And that would allow people, for instance, put money into political organizing. Could be used to do matching campaign donations so that, maybe third parties have a real chance, like socialist parties. There's a lot of ways the money could be used that's not used to pay bureaucrats that can be more productive. There's the point of stigma that when people are receiving welfare programs, they're different than everyone else. They're looked down on, they're frowned on for a long time. Even when I was eligible for food stamps, when I was working full time, I didn't do them when I was working in retail before I started working in MES because I was stuck in a rural area after grad school, doing research biology. There are no jobs in research biology in the middle of nowhere. And family failed to follow their promises, help me move, and I listened to bullshit from my father about borrowing as little loans as possible, not getting too much into debt. I could have borrowed, not put money I made working into tuition, had a war chest saved up, and moved right to a city, got a job in research biology when I was fresh out of school. My degrees were recent. But instead, I was stuck in a rural area working retail. But I was making so little, I was eligible for food stamps. Did I apply for them? Did I get them? No, I didn't do that. Or Medicaid. I was eligible for both while working full time because minimum wage was like $7.25 an hour back then. Could have could have received those programs, but I didn't because of the stigma, because I was worried people would find out, because I was worried people would frown on me and discriminate against me based on being in these programs. That's not a factor with UBI because everyone, people who are rich, people who are poor, they all get the check. Now, the rich people might pay more in extra taxes than they get in the check. And this bullshit argument, we shouldn't give it the rich, that's just a slippery slope to no. The whole point is to eliminate that kind of crap. It's easier to give $1,000 or $2,000 a month to a billionaire and then tax them $100,000 than it is to create forms where you have to prove your income that people have to fill out and deal with bureaucrats. People who are talking about not giving it the rich, they're either in bad faith, they want to destroy the program, or they want to maintain these bureaucrat jobs that need to go. Part of the advantage of UBI is getting rid of these bureaucrats and making people not have to deal with them or reassign the bureaucrats to agencies that are understaffed. We don't even necessarily need to reduce the number of bureaucrats. I can tell you there are so many government agencies that are working on skeleton crews that you have to wait forever to speak to a human being. We could just take the bureaucrats who are administering some of these programs, welfare programs, that could theoretically be reduced or cut, and put them into other government agencies that are understaffed. Yes, there would be retraining, but bureaucrat to bureaucrat retraining rather, and say retraining a coal miner to work these jobs, it should be easier to retrain the other bureaucrat and reduce some of the staffing shortages in the government. So you'd still have the same number of bureaucrats, they just wouldn't be doing the administering these welfare type programs. Now, to not screw over people like, say, me, who are disabled, such you would need to make the benefit of UBI enough that people are better off receiving it than they were with the welfare programs. And because there's going to be some inflation, it can't be like, well, you're receiving, for instance, SSI is like $960 a month. It can't be, we'll give you $1,000 a month UBI, because cost of living go up when everyone's receiving this, and that would be like getting $700 or $800 a month. It'd be even worse. It should be like people get $2,000 a month, because half of that will be higher cost of living. That's like getting $1,000 today, because the cost of living will go up. There will be some increase in rents and food prices, and so that's a little bit better than receiving $960 a month, and it's done across the board. And if then the discussion becomes, if there's a group of people who has too much money after getting this money, then you raise their taxes. Feel the billionaires or the millionaires have benefited too much, well, you raise their taxes. Well, it's easy enough to add like a 0.01% to the billionaire's tax rate, so they're getting an extra $1,000 a month in taxes. And, 0.02% to millionaires. The point being is that it's simpler, it reduces bureaucracy, and it reduces stress. And a lot of the reason that something like UBI would actually lead to better sex for most people is because they would be less stressed, and better mental health is well known to lead to better sexual health. So those things are closely related. Now, the following is an interview with Professor Matt Smith, an expert in the history of mental illness and psychiatry and fellow Psychology Today blogger. His new work explores universal basic income and how governments, health systems, and citizens might address both poverty and mental illness. So let's just read through this for a second, because I'm trying to alternate here between these articles, which you should absolutely read, my own thoughts here, which you should absolutely consider. Just because someone doesn't have a PhD in their name doesn't mean that their ideas aren't useful and interesting and important. I know I'm not as bright as I was. I was high in the genius range before long COVID. Probably in the top 0.1% of the population intelligence, and I probably function at a level that's like only in the top 40% of the population now or something. It's a huge drop on my effective intelligence. I with the brain fog from this disease, but I still have useful insights just as ordinary people do, and you shouldn't ignore me, just as what I'm saying, but you should definitely read these articles. Universal basic income is a guaranteed income paid to every citizen with no strings attached. It lifts everyone above the poverty line, and because it is guaranteed, reduces a great deal of stress associated with unemployment and changes in the welfare system. Now, this is important. Changes in the welfare system, because these policies, one of the biggest problems with existing welfare systems is they're highly bureaucratic and they're hidden from the public eye. And so you get all these little rules changes that occur all the time that people aren't even aware of because there's too many programs and people can't keep track of them all, the general public. For instance, in the mid-1990s, Newt Gingrich sat down with Bill Clinton and passed this shitty evil change to SSDI that said that work for Universities, when you're more than a half-time student. Religious organizations and certain classes of nonprofits and political organizations would not earn payroll tax contributions. Therefore, they wouldn't pay work credits in SSDI. Therefore, a lot of young people who got disabled early in life and had worked for these sort of organizations, like they'd worked for a religious charity for a while, or they'd worked for certain nonprofits for, a couple years after college, or they went to grad school, or they did both. They went to grad school, then worked for one of these nonprofits. They would get fucked. They wouldn't have enough work credits. They wouldn't be able to get SSDI if something happened, whether they got hit by a car or they got disabled by a virus like long COVID, which, I mean, maybe that wasn't on the public radar in the 90s. I think the main virus that caused disability back then was HIV, and that's what people are thinking of. And there was a lot of bias and bigotry against, because people thought only gay people got it, which is a load of shit. Straight people get HIV, and a whole lot of them have it across the world now. But because of that bias, perhaps that was not being considered fairly. But young people get disabled all the time. And if they worked for a nonprofit trying to make the world better, or they spent time in grad school, they can get fucked. I personally got fucked because of the time I spent in graduate school. If I had done the same work I did, private sector, never gone to grad school, not working more, just same work, I would have had SSDI work credits. I would have been able to get disability, SSDI disability, as opposed to SSI, which is only if you have very low assets. Because I spent time in grad school, in addition to my work improving myself, the work I did didn't count, and I got fucked. This rule escaped public notice because the welfare system is complicated and people don't know when things like this happen. Most people probably don't know about this rule, even though it's more than 30 years old now, because there's so much propaganda that, oh, if you get disabled, there's disability there for you. And people lie about, oh, I know this person who doesn't need it is getting it. They usually don't even know the difference between SSDI and SSI, these people. Sometimes they're outright lying. Sometimes they're confusing private disability insurance with public. That is, there's like a company like Aflac that they got disability from, not the Social Security Administration. There's a lot of right-wing shittiness. My own father was nasty about some neighbor who supposedly explained the system. I'm asking, like, was this neighbor of yours, were they on SSDI or SSI? Oh, I don't know. Was it private insurance? I don't know. He probably doesn't even, this person probably wasn't even receiving the help he thought they were. He didn't know shit. He just wanted to look down on someone. And this plays into how people perceive the welfare system. Because information is opaque, not readily accessible, people form myths, they form opinions that are not based on fact. Changes go by that aren't noticed, and it's stressful, and the system changes all the time in ways that people won't be able to predict, and it's more frequent, and it creates stress. It also allows, so that's a factor of the welfare system that UBI would help largely eliminate by consolidating things into a single central program that everyone would be able to watch and know changes to, which is what some of the New Deal programs are originally supposed to be, but then they branched out into these complicated, messy, bureaucratic systems that had a million ways they could screw people out of getting the help they need, and stress about whether you'd be screwed over or not, even if you aren't. Like, I might be able to appeal the whole SSDI thing if I get in front of an administrative judge. That might be possible, but there's huge stress about it, and worry, and whether it's even worth getting a disability lawyer to try and challenge it just could be a bunch of wasted time, and I'm struggling to survive, so my time is precious, or at least the impact of wasting it will be huge, when I could have maybe made enough YouTube videos and made that one that hit it big and survived off this, instead of wasting time fighting a system that's designed to screw me. Which is kind of the point, that people won't even try to fight these systems anyways. It also allows people more opportunity to change their lives for the better, be that returning to school, becoming a musician, artist, or actor, artist, writing the great American novel, The Next Great American Novel, volunteering for a cause they care about, or starting up a business. Well, right now, if you volunteer for a cause you care about, you might be screwing yourself out of SSDI work credits if you're not working as much, or if you're working for a nonprofit for pay, not getting the credits you think you're getting. So one more reason it'd be good to get rid of that system and do UBI. It allows people to live more independently, paying full-time parents and carers an income for the valuable work they do, for example. That is, because the money goes to everyone. You're not going to be omitting groups that often get ignored, like parents. It can also empower them to contribute more to their family and community. and it takes out all the red tape that hampers welfare systems all over the globe. By the way, this is intentional. The red tape exists so that people will get fewer resources. This is something most people fail to grasp. This red tape is there intentionally to harm people, which is why there's going to be a lot of resistance to doing something like UBI, because you get rid of that red tape and suddenly people who need help actually get it. And the powerful don't want that. They want desperate people. Those people will drive down wages. Those people will become homeless, and they can point to them and say, if you don't work harder, if you try and form a union and fire you, you just might end up like that. If you don't know what I mean, watch Ken Loach's film, I, Daniel Blake. My current research is on the history of social psychiatry in the United States. Social psychiatry was a preventative approach to mental health that thrived after the Second World War and was based on psychiatric epidemiology. So looking at the larger population patterns of mental illness and looking at larger societal changes you could use to contain those problems, the same way you would look at how you might contain, say, a pandemic by mask rules, or by having less crowded housing, or by having clean water, clean drinking water. Large-scale interdisciplinary research projects demonstrate that poverty, inequality, social isolation, community disintegration, which capitalism does a lot of, all contributed to poor mental health. Those are the exact socioeconomic conditions that UBI can address. The community disintegration one is one that's often ignored. The effects aren't going to be equal across all regions. When you do a UBI, if you support with taxes, you're more likely to be taxing the wealthier coastal states, and money is going to be going to the inland states of the United States, where communities are disintegrating because there aren't any jobs and people leave. You put some money into those communities, it creates jobs to meet needs, whether it's cleaning houses or restaurants or grocery stores. It helps support some amount of employment in those areas, slowing the disintegration or stopping it of some of these inland communities. Now, sure, that'll hurt the wealthier parts of America, but the vast inequality between this, quote, flyover states and the coastal communities is part of what's destroying the country. So that's worth it. Those are exact socioeconomic conditions UBI can address. If you want to prevent mental illness, consider implementing UBI. How did you come to support and research UBI? I'm a relatively recent convert to UBI. I first heard about it in 2014 in New Harmony, Indiana, at a conference celebrating the 200th anniversary of its founding by Robert Owen. So I believe New Harmony was one of those communes that used to exist in the United States. Yes, commune. U.S. had communes. These are small socialist, organized, socially cooperative, socialist towns usually. So they were towns, municipalities that were run in a socialist manner with collective ownership of the means of production. Most of them eventually came under attack by the government, or the people lost faith in it and they disintegrated, even though usually the statistics show they worked very well. Or, they were working well, but a few people at the top wanted to do better. And so they screwed everyone else over and took, positions of power and destroyed the system from within. That's kind of what happened to the Oneida Commune, for instance. One of the keynote lectures was by the late Eric Olin Wright. His title was something like "Why Capitalism Won't Exist by 2030" or something like that. Right. No, systems change slower than people expect, even when they're not working well. I was losing patience with the talk until, toward the end, he mentioned UBI, and I could see where he was coming from. I've never been a dogmatist when it comes to politics or social policy. Although I lean left, I can see some of the rationale behind neoliberalism and certainly some of the shortcomings of hard-line left-wing politics. There's always people like this. They police themselves from going too far to the left, what they consider too far, because really they're worried about stigma, they're worried about it being scary, they still have internalized negative beliefs. I'm sorry, but this is just bullshit. The hardline left wing is honestly where we need to be going, because capitalism will kill us all someday with the climate change, and it's leading the planet towards nuclear war over diminishing water resources, among other things. And towards mass technological unemployment, which socialism can instead turn into shorter working hours. But that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be mass unemployment, so that the remaining people who do work for pitiful wages and work very long hours. And under capitalism, usually better to have a huge number of unemployed people, a few people working real long hours, than to spread the work more evenly. Because the goal of capitalism is to maximize profits, and that includes, the costs of managing large numbers of people HR wise, versus hyper exploiting a few people who you also have to invest less in education training because you train once and you get all this labor out of them. It's not about what's the greatest human well-being, and it never has been. Capitalism is a terrible system. The beauty of UBI is that it works for both left and right. Well, not really. In theory, there's left and right-wing directions you could take it, just like there's left and right-wing directions you could take having an income tax. Heck, you could even tax only the poor with income tax, not the rich. It's a tool. How it's used determines whether it helps left-wing or right-wing politics. That's what people miss. It addresses the inequality and poverty that concerns the left, can address it, doesn't necessarily address it, and it could be a powerful force for entrepreneurialism, something the right would support. Perhaps most important, not necessarily even that. The biggest problem to entrepreneurialism is regulations and large companies throwing their weight around, which isn't going to change with UBI. If people are still buying all their stuff on Amazon, small businesses are still going to go out of business. Perhaps most importantly, in transcending politics, could help us create a society that values production rather than consumption. And that is essential if we want to repair a relationship with the environment. Right. No. If you want to repair your relationship with the environment, we need to reduce the total amount of production and consumption and the population and stop expanding with endless sprawl, build up if we need more housing instead of out, set aside more land as preserve natural ecosystems, and reduce the amount of CO2 reproduced in pollution, not value production rather than consumption. This is a load of shit, he's saying. How and why does UBI fill a gap in existing mental health treatment? By preventing and reducing the impact of mental illness, UBI would be a benefit to mental health workers in 3 key ways that would facilitate. First, it would 3 key ways that would facilitate. Well, this isn't even really proper grammar, and of course he's hyper-focused only on mental health workers, him being one. First, it would simply reduce the number of people in need of treatment, particularly those with mild or moderate mental illness. Somewhat, yeah. Second, since those coping with mental illness would be in receipt of UBI, mental health workers wouldn't have to spend so much time trying to ensure that the basic needs of their patients are being met. That's an issue. This is something I struggle with, even just like there's occasional social workers and stuff. I'm like, sure, you can connect me a therapy thing for a little bit of anxiety, but the real problem I'm having is that I'm in danger of homelessness, not needing therapy, or it's needing physical resources and being able to meet my basic physical needs more than a year down the line, because a year and a half from now I'd be broke, living off savings. That's high is again not even enough to pay rent in most parts of the country, and even where it is, it's only with a lot of roommates, and that's risky because if a roommate picks up and leaves you paying for the rent, can't keep up with it, you'll end up getting evicted or having to suddenly find housing in a hurry, and not with the roommates, and then you still can't make the rent wherever you go. It's just better to have a 1-bed that only you're paying on a short-term lease than a 3-bed that you're paying for on your own. And there's a lot of shittiness of people, especially in lower income places, that just pick up. I've heard all sorts of horror stories. People just pick up and leave the roommates hanging for the rent. I mean, some of the people are poor because they're responsible. Some are poor because they're disabled. There's a huge number of reasons why people are poor, and there's no one size fits all. And they all have to live and work and interact with each other. And some groups have toxic and selfish behaviors that affect others, such as those who are poor because they're irresponsible, tending to hurt those who had no choice about being poor because disability. I know from experience this can dominate one's interactions with patients or clients, thus interfering with therapy or other forms of support or treatment. He's correct about that. By the way, I've also trained in providing some mental health stuff as well as some receipt of it. So I've been on both sides of like seeing these kind of things. And interacted peripherally, like when I was in EMT, I interacted peripherally with mental health providers. Finally, if UBI could help provide a considerable amount of fairly banal, environmentally triggered mental health problems, mental health workers and researchers could have more time and energy to deal with the more intractable causes of mental illness, ranging from genetic factors to childhood sexual abuse. It's like Archimedes in the bath. You know that eureka moment? Archimedes represents, that's just an old course. Someone like this would go back to Archimedes. This guy is fundamentally an idealist rather than materialist. That's why he won't let himself become, say, a socialist, because idealism is a bullshit way of looking in the world. There are, by the way, idealist socialists. They've existed, but they're very few in number. That movement kind of died off in the 1800s, so most socialists are materialists. The difference being idealists think that ideas exist and the world reflects it, and Archimedes and Aristotle and this hyper worship of like these great Western philosophers and so-called great men that goes right along with idealism. Materialism is the idea that our reality is conditioned. I mean, our experiences are conditioned by our reality. The reality is a physical thing that exists, that there isn't some perfect world of ideas that exists outside of reality. By the way, that was one of Aristotle's idea, and you see it with Descartes. It's mirrored and repeated over and over in so-called Western philosophy. Materialist philosophies tend to be somewhat more popular in Eastern cultures, although India's Buddhist traditions are very idealist as well. Archimedes was not the great man he makes him out to be entirely. I mean, he was brilliant, but he existed within a social context that was able to support his work, that was able to, in his case, there was exploitation and even slavery that was enabling him to focus on mental pursuits, whereas I was a genius who might have been on that level before I got long COVID, and I was trapped by family abuse, poverty, all these different factors that didn't allow me to live up to my potential. And when I was able to get in a situation where I could get enough beyond these to really even show a fraction of what I was capable of, I was getting straight A's and a special master's. My professors all agreed I was brilliant. This is picking from among graduate students, and they agreed that I was one of the most brilliant ones they'd ever seen. I finally showed my capabilities, and I got disabled the virus. So Archimedes existed as a product of his environment in part. Great man theory is bullshit. And he didn't discover ideas that existed outside of reality. He discovered things about the natural world that were already true. Archimedes represents all the mental illness that is caused or exacerbated by socioeconomic factors UBI could mitigate. If we get Archimedes out of the damned bath, then the mental health system will always be overflowing. That sudsy metaphor makes any sense. No, that sudsy metaphor does not make any sense unless you get deep into his idealist point of view, which I'm not going to. It's a freaking stupid way of looking at the world, which I've escaped from and I'm not going back to. Why does UBI matter in the age of COVID-19? COVID-19 has changed the playing field when it comes to UBI in many ways. First, it has created a precedent by governments paying unprecedented amounts of money to ensure the financial security of the population. Why not go all the way and offer people UBI and the peace of mind that brings? Because the billionaires don't want it. That's why. Because capitalism is always ruled by the billionaires. That's why. Go and become a socialist, buddy, instead of this social democratic bullshit. Before you say that we can afford that, many economists argue that UBI would pay for itself in economic growth. If it's just redistribution, it shouldn't affect economic growth. If it gets ordinary people to invest more, to save and buy stocks, to have enough money that they can afford to have a bank account and even buy small penny stocks or whatever. Not penny stocks. Penny stocks are actually like scams, but to buy a couple shares of an index fund, and they're putting money into economic growth the same way the billionaires are, although without the fancy tax evasion tools the billionaires have. I'm arguing it would also pay for itself in improved health outcomes. Second, UBI has demonstrated that both physical and mental disease discriminates on the basis of income. Not only have poorer people been more vulnerable to COVID-19, correct, they've also been more vulnerable to the hardships of lockdown. Oh yeah, this is why I was in grad school. I was pissed when there's some students, once the pandemic hit and everything moved remote, and some of them are like, we're all in this together, and I'm looking at their Zoom, and they're sitting in a mansion, and I'm sitting in a shitty basement apartment. Could have been shittier, but took a little bit of a risk of going a higher rent place, not expecting I was going to end up getting disabled with COVID and being able to borrow the student loans and learn from the past. Anyways, and they're like, we're all in this together. It's like, no, we're not all in this together. the hardships of lockdown absolutely do not affect someone as much who's living in a mansion up in like beautiful alpine area as they do someone who people thought it was a fake background, and they're like, nope, this is actually where I lived. Some other students, even some other students who weren't so poor, were a little bit like looked at that person as askew when they said that we're on this together. Lockdown did not affect everyone equally. That's a load of shit that those at the top said so they could justify not having people come after them with higher taxes and stuff, or their families, because these younger people weren't going to pay higher taxes. They're worried their parents might. Historians of health and medicine have long demonstrated the relationship between poverty and poor health outcomes, but it often takes a pandemic to get this message through to politicians. Politicians know it, they just don't want to act on it. That's where he gets it wrong. He doesn't understand how much in bad faith most politicians really are. If we want a more mentally and physically healthier society, we need to start with people who are struggling socioeconomically, i.e., in terms of money. Socioeconomically is a term, of course, refers to how social status and economic status are interconnected in complex ways. This is not only humane, but it will also pay off in terms of healthcare costs. It doesn't matter if it would or when it's humane, it should be done. This lesson has even more resonance when considered in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has shown a light in the constant mental strain endemic racism places in the lives of people of color. Yeah, he doesn't elaborate on this at all, so this is just a shout out to a group without explaining. He has a point there, but he doesn't elaborate. Finally, the pregnant pause that COVID-19 gave us has made many people think a bit more about what matters to them. Nature, time with family, though not necessarily homeschooling, pursuing non-economic interests, all of these things really matter, but the daily grind obscures this fact. We've been forced to transform our lives temporarily in a way that has allowed many of us the opportunity to reassess our priorities. UBI could help us make those changes permanent, and that'd be good for mental health. During the pandemic, I didn't have any free time to reflect. I was busy with grad school, but yeah, I got that a lot of people had that experience. All right, well, I hope you folks enjoyed this, found my commentary interesting. Do go back, read this book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Social, and do leave comments, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. There are a lot of things I didn't get to talk about. I ended up guided more than I thought I would be by these articles, but I did want to not just sit here and talk. I will say, though, to summarize, there are good reasons for UBI. Some of the stuff that people like Hakeem say is accelerationism. They want the system to destroy itself, even if they won't put it in those terms. They don't want UBI because it's a, quote, band-aid on the gaping flesh wound. Correct. But you don't just not treat a bad problem just because it's not a sufficient treatment. You do whatever you can, and you try and make it so you can do more. The system is self-destructing. That doesn't mean we should not try and at least alleviate some of the suffering. UBI could help with that. How it's paid for, that is a valid concern. But it's not like we can't afford it like right-wingers. It's just we need to make sure that the money is not coming from the poor, but is coming from the wealthy. And with the rich so the conservatives will object to taxing the rich more. They need to understand that the rich are rich through exploitation of labor, through extraction of surplus value. This is why Marxist ideas have to play a factor in this. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, but I am a democratic socialist, and I will defend to the death if need be, and it may become that with the way our system is moving towards fascists who will hunt down people with views like mine and kill them. But that laborers are exploited. Their bosses take a lot of value from them, don't pay them as much as they produce. They won't hire someone unless they can do that. So even though you could theoretically hire someone and pay them every cent of value they produce, they won't, because why would someone hire someone like that? And they won't even hire up to that point where there's barely any difference, because there's actually whole economic models that talk about this. As people start hiring towards the point of no profit on workers, all the other workers will expect to be paid the same rate as those higher wage workers, and it will cut into the profits that they were already making from those workers. So employers will intentionally not hire up to the point of no more profit per worker. And this is part of what creates the necessity of unemployment under capitalism. There will always be an underclass under capitalism. And that extracted surplus value is part of how Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk is Elon Musk. So taxing them is not taking money from their hard work. It's taking back some of the money that they extracted from other people's hard work. But the logic of exploitation and talking about extraction of surplus value is something that is not done because there's this, how would I say it, this taboo on talking about anything Marxist in the U.S. political culture. The politicians are all on the side of capitalists. And, whenever someone accuses them of being a socialist, they look at you with like one eyebrow raised. They're like, what? Because none of them, Democrats, Republicans, none of the major parties, not really even the Greens, are socialists. You got like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, CPUSA, and like little tiny third parties, but you don't have any major socialist parties, and these other parties are ignored, erased, and intentionally suppressed. So there is no discussion of things like extraction of surplus value. And that's what perverts these discussions. That discussion has to be had in the context of UBI to come to the right conclusions. Well, anyways, read this, get this book. Hope you folks enjoyed this video. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star to lead you on. Until next time, it's Northstar. I do. And best luck.